Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. So welcome to the Ake Festival, and today we're going to have a very interesting, engaging discussion on gender and feminism. I'm your moderator for today. My name is Shiko Kimeria. I'm a writer, I'm a traveler, I'm an explorer, and I'm the Africa editor at Quartz, which is a media house that focuses on technology, innovation, and business. And we have three amazing guests for today's discussion. We have Pumla Dineo Kola, we have Tola Sarumi, and we have Jola Ayeye. So I hope, I look forward for the discussion to start, and I look forward for everyone hearing the amazing insights that have been brought by these three power women. And I will hand over to them now at this point to give a brief introduction of themselves and especially talk about their work where it relates to gender and feminism. Thank you. We can start in the order that I mentioned the names.
Hello, I'm very happy to be part of this panel. My name is Pumla Dineo Kola, as Chico has said. I am a feminist author and professor of literature. I live in South Africa. I teach at the Nelson Mandela University. My work relates to this topic. I am an author of 6 books, and I think all of them deal with gender in one way or another. I'm probably best known outside the academy for my book, Rape is a South African Nightmare, which tries to understand how it is that South Africa arrives at a place where it is considered one of the most dangerous countries for women to live, and why we have a rape crisis. My most recent book is Female Fear Factory, which tries to expand on that and to think about the ways in which gender is wrought in patriarchal terms through fear. I think I'll stop there, and perhaps something else will come up in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Pumla. Tola next.
Hi, good morning. My name is Tola Sarumi. I'm pretty much a social commentator on the issues of gender and female sexuality and femaleness in general. I haven't written a book, but I might work on it and get to that at some point in the future. But yes, I will leave it there. I am a social commentator on gender, sexuality, and female sexuality. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you're based in Nigeria?
Sorry, I'm based in London, United
London.
Kingdom. That's
okay.
Right.
Sounds great. Okay, next we'll go to Jola.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Jola Ayeye. I am a screenwriter and producer and podcaster. I haven't written any books either, and just like Tola, I am a social commentator and avid feminist. I don't really have any academic work that sums up my ideas and ideologies around feminism and gender. It's more of social commentary. So yes, I'm very excited to be here.
So moving on, the first question I want to ask everyone has 2 parts. First, how do you define gender? And then how do you define feminism in your own words?
I define gender as a system, a social and institutionalized system that seeks to order who people are and how people behave according to what is assumed to be their sex. So gender under patriarchy, which is the way in which we know gender the most in our current moment, insists that there are 2 genders, man and woman, which correspond to male and female. But gender is really an ordering system that pretends to be a natural categorization. So feminism is a movement that I see myself as belonging to, because I do identify as a feminist, that seeks to end the way in which patriarchy makes gender a prison. So it seeks to end the domination of women, which is what patriarchy is for, and it seeks to free us from this cage of gender to be able to be a whole range of things, to live our full potential and not be limited by what patriarchal society says we are.
Great, thank you. And Tola?
Yes, I would define gender as an order as well, but I don't come from a society where gender is a binary. So I will definitely define gender as an order. And I think as a result of colonization, Christianization, and Islamization of my people, I think, yes, it has sort of moved into being a binary, but it's mostly an order that allows society to place burdens or privileges on members of whichever relevant sex we're discussing at the time. But yes, gender is an order for the purposes of identification, acculturation, and relation between humans. So based on sex, based on culture, based on the society you're speaking about, it is an order. And for me, feminism is actually the movement for social justice, legal justice, and cultural justice for women wherever they might be all over the world. I don't define myself as a feminist anymore, but yes, I do belong to the feminist umbrella.
Jola, the question we are addressing right now is how you define gender and feminism.
It's about equality for women in all its different ramifications: equality of opportunity, access, freedom, politically, socially, economically. And my understanding of gender is that it's a codified set of behaviors attributed to individuals based on their sex. It's pretty social. It's like agreed upon norms in some way that society has agreed benefits the world for men and women to behave based on their sexes. So that's what I understand gender to be, and that's what I understand feminism to be. I keep it very, very simple. This sense of unfairness and annoyance and anxiety was purposeful and was for a reason. Like, I'm not strange or weird or somehow. And yeah, that I think that's around the time. Unfortunately, I wasn't kind of raging from raging from the womb. I bought into the delusion of that feminism is about this group of just strange, very, very angry for nothing, even though there's so much to be angry about. I bought into that idea for a very long time and tried to fit into the mold of what I ought to do as a young woman or as a lady, whatever that means, till I was a late teenager. And just wasn't working for me. I'm quite selfish in that it wasn't serving me in any way. And so I began to embrace and try to understand even further what it would take to be more free, to have more opportunities and access and freedom really was very important to me. And that's when I embraced becoming and being feminist.
I think what you said, Tola, was very interesting. So for this question, I'll have you start fast. You said you no longer define yourself as a feminist. So my first question was actually what made you first define yourself as a feminist? And Pumla, I'd love to also know after that from you, what moment, like what was the moment when you actually said I'm a feminist? Was it a particular action that happened that drove you to that decision? So yes, we'll start with Tola for that one.
So I pretty much grew up around women who drove me to that path. I think from when I was a child. I think my earliest realization was probably when I was 12, 13, thereabouts, 12 or 13. I started reading works. I moved to the UK as a child and just looking for my place in the world and being around women who were that way inclined. I started to read and understand what the fight was about. You can't sort of start reading Jermaine Greer and Alice Walker and women of that ilk and not sort of identify with and be able to see some of the things that you've been through in their works. So I started identifying with feminism and calling myself proudly a feminist from probably when I was 12 or 13. That's how I got started, yes.
Sounds, and if you don't mind me asking, what then made you stop defining yourself that way?
I think I no longer see myself or the struggles that I identify with or the struggles that the women around me are sort of going through in this Western idea of feminism. Right? Like I said, I live in the UK, and what feminism, and increasingly I find that I'm interacting with feminism online and feminists online. And I find that much of the discussion, much of the struggle, much of the engagement are around issues that I don't think women are centered. So I found it hard to continue to identify with, engage with, and continue to claim an intellectual sisterhood with people who no longer center women in their feminism. I find that it looks like something else now, and it doesn't represent me, and it doesn't represent the women that I'm immediately concerned about, because I do think feminism is local in the first instance. So yeah, that's why I no longer identify with feminism as seen and practiced in the West where I currently reside. Yeah.
Sounds good. What about you, Pumla?
So for me, I started calling myself a feminist. So I started using the word feminist when I was 15. But that's just because I discovered the word at 15. And the reason I could use it at 15 was because I recognized that it describes something that I already was. So I like to make a distinction between how long I've been a feminist and how long I've been calling myself a feminist. So I've been calling myself a feminist since 15 because I discovered the word 50. I think I've always been a feminist. I think that the most stark sense in which, or time in which I became aware of the need to be a feminist, or how I discovered I was a feminist before the word, was when I started school, because I was raised in a family. My parents had 3 girls, and I had a baby brother who was a baby. We were raised very much in a family, and maybe just the way they organized their lives, in which I'd never felt that being a girl was something wrong or less than. And so going to school, it was very, and going to school and entering, even at primary school, like very first year of school, entering a system where often the fact of my being a girl was often, or sometimes the fact of my not being a boy, was often used against me. So this kind of very rigid sense of what subject. So there were weird things. I mean, I'm 48, so I'm talking about I started school in 1978. So I enter school, and suddenly there are strange things about being a girl and being a boy matters in very strange things. I was very much a climber, so the ways in which I was playing was suddenly wrong for a girl. I was expected to do crazy things like sewing, which was a very strange thing for me, sewing instead of gardening. And it seemed to me that actually the boys who were doing gardening were not doing any gardening at all. They just had lots of playtime while the girls sat and had to learn weird things like sewing, in addition to the more conventional academic subjects. And so increasingly then, as I entered school, it felt as though I was constantly being told that there was something wrong with being a girl, that there was something wrong with the way in which I was a girl, the things I liked, the things I didn't like. My instinct wasn't to believe it. My instinct was to kind of push back against this. So I didn't like it. And I was very unhappy with it. And I was very unsuccessful in teaching myself to like and to believe and to be in the boxes that I kept being put into. And so then it comes initially with so my feminist consciousness at that point comes very much with, on the one hand, a deep discomfort and unhappiness with what I'm supposed to be, and that desire to be left alone to be what I felt was more in line with who I felt I was. School is where I first become aware of how incredibly powerful this idea of gender is, and the idea of what a girl is, and my resistance to it. But I find the word then several years later as I'm finishing high school, really. And then I claim that name because it at that point allows me to recognize that it's not just me and my girlfriends. There are many other girls and women in the world who don't want to be this smaller version that we and more useful version that we being bullied into.
Sounds great. So I have a few comments, or not comments, but a few reactions to work from everyone here that I found quite interesting. And I'd love to hear from you, because those are just my observations of what I found interesting, but I'd love to hear from you what was the most compelling or surprising thing that you learned in your research, in your field, in your work that ties to gender and feminism. So for Pumla, for me, it was when I read Rape, a South African Nightmare. 2 things stood out. One was you talked about the normalization of rape, and how now the headlines in South Africa, the stories that make headlines in South Africa, it has to be a very gruesome story. It has to be either a baby has been defiled, or a grandma has been defiled, or someone has been, murdered brutally. But there was everyday rape, which was just so normalized. And then the other thing that really struck me was you described a scene in the book where a woman enters a shop, and I think a man enters the shop and tries to hit on her, and she ignores him. And then he tells her, "This is why we rape women like you." And no one said anything except one other woman. And so you're talking about how there's this rape culture and everyone just kind of ignores it. And so they are the rapists, but there's also, general societal norms that perpetuate this culture where men think they can say something, where men think they own women and they own their bodies. So those are two areas I'd love you to talk about, but also you can add something else. You can talk about something else if it's more interesting for you. For Tola, what I found was, it was on a lighter note, it was, you wrote about how Yemi Alade, despite the amazing work she's doing, she kind of gets forgotten behind, Whiskey, Davido, Burna Boy, and you said it's really a big part of it must be because she's a woman, and so the criticisms on her are much higher than they are on, men in the industry, and you felt that she could have gotten much further if she was a man in the industry. And for Joel, I would love for you to add an anecdote or an interesting work from your storytelling life. So I'll pause there, hand over to Umla, Tola, and Jola in that order for reactions.
Thank you, Chico. The irony of the South African situation, as I see it, is that on the one hand, more often than not, there is some big, spectacular case of rape or femicide in the papers that everybody's appalled by, that everybody's horrified by, that everybody's heartbroken by. And the more spectacular and gruesome and dramatic, the bigger the shock and the horror and the outcry. On the other hand, if you look at the way in which women, ordinary women and girls, navigate their lives in South Africa, it's with this constant awareness of the possibility that you will be attacked in a variety of ways, in any number of ways, because you're a woman or a girl. If you look at how we negotiate really simple things, like the Soul City Institute, which is a feminist media institute, recently had a few public service announcements, I think end of last year, beginning of this year, I can't remember exactly when. And one of them illustrates this quite well for me. So there's two, it shows two people going out to jog, a man and a woman. The man is dressed in his, running gear. He's getting ready to leave his house. He grabs his keys and he takes a swig of his water, and then he's out the door. He's got his, step counter or whatever, but he's out the door. The woman is dressed very similarly, has her step counter thing. She grabs her keys and then she pauses. And she sends an SMS, a text message to her friends with her route, the route that she plans to run. She then gets ready to leave. She pauses again and she grabs her keys and she looks at her keys and kind of holds them. Clearly there's some question in her mind. She gets ready to leave. She pauses again. She grabs her mace. And it is only once she grabs her mace, she's let people know exactly what time she's leaving, what her route is, and so on, before she then leaves the house. So it takes her a good 3-4 minutes, perhaps, is the implication. I mean, the PSA itself is very short, but the implication is that it takes her at least 2 or 3 minutes longer to leave the house, because even something as healthy and as good for her as going for a run is gendered in this society. So on the one hand, you have this idea of kind of constant shock, which I argue in my work prevents us as a society from really doing something about rape culture, doing something about the war on women. We have very high femicide rates as well, not just kind of very high rape rates. And so on the one hand, you have this thing where we're constantly being with constant collective shock. On the other hand, something is not right, because it can't be both shocking and so constant in women's heads in this society. So I make that argument then to sort of say something about, well, we need to think about who the rapist is. We need to think about who the violent man is. And we need to stop thinking about it as a kind of spectacular, exceptional occurrence, because it obviously isn't. And we need to also stop thinking about men who kill women and rape women in this country as a small fringe minority, because it's not possible to have the numbers we have, to have the constant fear that women have, and kind of policing and trying to think about, okay, at least if something happens to me, somebody should find me, because that's really what that woman is doing. She's saying, if something, as I go on my jog, there's a very high possibility something will happen to me. If I send this route, at least there's the possibility that I might be found alive, hopefully, but not necessarily, because we also have the possibility of not being found. And then the second example is it's from the chapter Female Fear Factory, which in Rape in South Africa Nightmare, and it's a story of Lebupule, and it's one of my favorite stories. So I'm glad you liked it too, Chico, because I sometimes feel like I tell the story too much and read at writer events. And it's a story of Lebupule, who's a feminist activist and biographer. who enters a shop in Johannesburg and encounters a man harassing a woman, right? In a shop. There's lots of other people in the shop. He tries to get her attention. She does all the things that women are trained to do. She moves away. She turns her body away. She tries to not draw attention to herself while getting away from him. It doesn't work. And she moves to a different part of the shop. And eventually she just loses it. Eventually she snaps and she says, just leave me alone. And he says, this is why we rape you. And Lebupule, of course, unlike all the other people in the shop who are standing by and watching and all of this, screams at this man, why is this why you rape us? How many women have you raped? And kind of challenges him with kind of fury. And so he flees the shop. And I use that as an incredible example of saying, yes, of course, we're all primed in this society to just watch and learn the lessons about fear and what we should be afraid of, and to know that nobody's going to actually come to your defense in South Africa if you get attacked, more often than not in public. But in fact, part of shifting the collective consciousness is to act like Lebupule and not mind your business, and not, and make the violent man in this situation uncomfortable, rather than simply confirming what gives them confidence, which is the commonplace in this country.
No, thank you. And I think what you've said is so deep and insightful, because it's exactly that element of everyone. If people don't say something, then in some way they're complicit. So there's the man who's threatening her, but everyone else who keeps quiet, and you multiply that across the country, across the continent. Yeah, I see how that happens. And next, Tola.
So, I'm often a commentator on pop culture as well. And I think it's interesting that you brought up the Yemi Alade example. And when you juxtapose what's going on in Nigerian music, because that's what I'm familiar with the history of gender and female representation in popular culture, it's kind of amusing how it's obvious that there's sort of been this backward shift. Yeah. So I'm an 80s baby. And obviously, as I came up, I saw, primarily I'm into hip hop. So I saw women in rap music. And I saw their presentation. I saw how the music was packaged. I saw how you almost had to prove that you were gender neutral in order to exist in that space, right? So you had women in their baggy trousers, baggy shirts. That was sort of the norm in those days, mid 90s, late 90s, early 90s. But then you've got this gradual shift, occurring now, where the hypersexualization of the female artist, the hypersexualization of the lyrics, the hypersexualization of the delivery of the lyrics is sort of the norm now, right? So you're speaking to a Nigerian market that is both conservative vis-a-vis sex, or at least publicly, both conservative vis-a-vis sex and female presentation, and also expecting a woman to be very sexy. So when it comes to gender, you are allowed, in theory, to exist in a sort of hybrid where you're not too sexy. They'll accept a kind of almost tomboyish presentation, but at the same time you have to be hyper feminine. So it's kind of weird, because you have a woman like Yemi Alade who came out at a time where I think there was probably only another popular female singer on the scene, Tiwa Savage, and then there's her. She's a dancer, she's a writer, she's a producer, probably one of our best live performers and our best touring act, I think, alongside Wizkid, Davido, Flavor. She was one of our best touring acts at the time she debuted. But, they hardly ever spoke about her, because I think, as it is with culture, in a lot of places, but in Nigeria especially, much of the consumption in terms of the buying of the music, you find is actually done by young women. But much of the success, the coverage, the attention is on men. So you look at it and it's almost amusing, because I was drawn obviously to pop culture because I found a place. I'm not a woman who fits neatly into any gender boxes, right? So pop culture is obviously the best place for me to express myself. But to see the kind of slow and gradual reversal of what it means to be a woman in music, especially in the music space, is mildly disturbing. And I think for me, when I was riffing about Yemi Alade, it was kind of a frustration of the failure to acknowledge exactly what it is she's done, right? And what her Africa-wide visibility meant in terms of just a narrow Nigerian kind of presence. And I think that was my frustration at the time when I was sort of sharing that anecdote about her. But generally, I think she represents She represents a kind of hybrid that Nigerian pop culture allows, while she also have to battle to be hyper feminine at the same time. So, yeah, it's just something unique to the Nigerian pop culture space, I think, and it's just something I observe and I comment on from time to time. So we are gradually moving towards a more American kind of female presentation in pop culture, even as we claim that we are conservative. So we're gradually moving towards, and this is not just in music, this is in film as well, gradually moving towards people getting, being more interested in having that prototypical Instagram ready body, right? We're moving towards our concerns, casual concerns being more Americanized, like for example, I might be told to go and close my teeth now. when I was a kid, having a gap teeth being gap toothed was nothing to remark on. So it's just little things like this, and then you find African women, Nigerian women wondering where their space is, or being sort of baffled or having to conform in ways that we weren't raised to think about, or ways that did not form a natural part of our evolution as women in Nigeria. So it's just part of what I comment on, part of what amuses me and kind of bemuses me. So it's an ongoing thing, and I think Yemiala at the time was just a handy example to illustrate the point.
Thanks. I think that's interesting, especially given like the global dominance of Afrobeat, but also just the Nigerian entertainment scene. So whether it's Netflix King of Boys coming out, but all the way Nigeria has really been a huge cultural influence, not just on the continent, but beyond, and trying to see how are women being relegated to a position where they don't get as much of the benefits as men. And your gap, that's so interesting because in my culture, Kikuyu culture, having a gap between your teeth it's the epitome of beauty. So I hope that's that's not a standard that
No,
changes.
I'm not sort of conscious of it. I think in my culture it was the same, but it's just as the world moves closer together, you find that young people will be aghast at having a gap, right? They don't want it. You're gonna get braces, you're gonna close it. But I did want to bring one thing quickly to your notice. In film, Nigerian women are almost overrepresented, if there's such a thing, right? We are so visible in film, writing, directing, sort of, production, whatever. We're quite visible, right? I think some of the biggest Nigerian film stars are women, but the reverse is the case with the music. You have maybe three or four. I think three or four is an exaggeration. So you've got Simi, Tiwa Savage, and now you've Yemi Alade. Now you've got
10.
What is this baby's name? Aya Star. So you've got like maybe four or five that you can name off the top of your head who are sort of making inroads. But when it comes to film, the industry is replete with women who sort of who move the needle. You've mentioned King of Boys, Kemi Aditiba is at the very forefront of that. You've got the outside star and performer of the event, which is what is her name again? I'm so sorry.
Shola Shobowale.
Shola, thank you, Shola Shobowale. You've got her. You've got the woman who plays the younger Shola Shobowale, Tony Tones. So film is a very big platform for Nigerian women, and we're thriving and excelling there. But because I'm primarily a music person, I wish the same could be said about music, and unfortunately, it cannot be said now. It's still very much a male dominated, and I think Files was speaking about this, or maybe it was Lady Poe, where you have women who go into the studio and you have to take into consideration the time. The people she's going to be surrounded with. We're going to be surrounded by men, male producers, male A&R, male record label owners, male taxi drivers. So she has to bear all these things in mind. If you want to be a female artist, it's probably safest to record in the evenings or in the early noons. But these are times where people in the industry are probably sleeping or doing other things. The industry really comes alive at night. So what does that mean for women? What does that mean for the chances of success of female artists? So these are the little things that maybe the public doesn't bear in mind. But yeah, we're still really grappling with that when it comes to Nigerian music. I just have to add that. Thank you.
Sounds good. And actually, that's a good segue then to Jola, since we're talking about film and storytelling and so on. I'd love to hear an anecdote from your work that revealed something very interesting to you about gender, feminism, or norms around that.
So one thing that I found very, very interesting in working in screenwriting and production is the topic of money and the way in which people react to so in production, money is like the most important thing. And I find that when I'm talking to fellow female filmmakers or women who have an interest in film, the process of funding is very, very interesting, and the conversations around money. So I have a male business partner, and I find that sometimes when we are having money conversations, when he is in the room, the tone is very, very different. And that's just a microcosm of the ways in which women find access to money and funding really, really difficult. So let me go back before I go forward. One of the things that endlessly kind of, I don't want to use the word fascinates, but kind of fascinates and upsets me is the ways in which women are reduced to a very specific kind of utility. Like, so a good woman is one that's very, very useful to a very male, like a male gaze. That's a good woman. That's a useful woman. A woman whose body is readily available, your labor is readily available, your time, your access, your resources. You do what you're told when you're told and how you're told, and you kind of, even better yet, you raise the next generation to do the exact same. Now, in an ever-changing world, where women are continuously kind of getting more of this equality that we're looking for, we're going out into the working world, we're trying to take our destiny into our own hands. The issue of money and access to money, access to funding, access to options, because that's what money is really, really important. And I found in my work that people love your ideas. People want to be involved or invested in the things you're doing. They want to show support, but only so much. And so when the real discussion comes up, which is where is the money to make this work going to happen, I find that men have very, very different conversations from women. The trust, the boundaries that include sort of like trust, the what I call it's a side eye. Where is she going to get the money from? Can she manage the money well? You are having continuous discussions and meetings about funding that your male counterparts don't really see as a discussion. And I really, really find that on our level, obviously very, very frustrating. But when you put that on the wider scale, you talk to women who work in music and tech and finance and academia, it's the same thing. So that's something that frustrates and confuses me each and every time that we have to have these conversations, kind of like we're moving the needle, but when it comes to funding, to the big push, which is where's the money going to come from in each and every sort of section or sector of life, it's the same thing. Women find it harder to access. So we get the pledges, the verbal pledges, the mentoring, that kind of support. Everyone is happy. But the real power is that money, because that money really, really gives you options. That money is really what it takes to get to the next level. And I mean that with everything. We could use it to talk about inheritance. A lot of traditions have very interesting ideas around women inheriting. We could talk about it in different sort of like world, publishing. Oh my God, publishing, tech, finance, when it's time to get the money to get things done, women have a much, 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 much harder time of getting these huge chunks of money. Everyone likes to talk about women and money in reference to like micro loans and that we pay back our loans better. If you give a woman money, she's going to nurture the entire family. She's going to send her kids to school and she's going to pay back the loans. Those conversations are things that people really like to have. But when you're talking about the big, the big bucks in different sectors of life, you find that women are highly underfunded, find it really, really difficult to access money and finance, and also find it really, really difficult to create and maintain these profitable, useful, ease of access to credit.
And in fact, I can give a quick reflection on that because at Quartz, the media house I work on, we focus on technology, innovation, and business. So we spotlight a lot of African startups. And I almost feel like every time I see a press release that says a certain startup was given certain millions of dollars of funding, I go and click on the picture and it's almost always men. So it's sad because women are over-mentored but underfunded. And there's the expectation that if women are in certain industries, it's soft industries. You're in social sectors, but there's a mentality that, we're not in tech, we're not in fintech, we're not in logistics, which is all a lie. So it's almost like the sectors that have a lot of money, can bring in a lot of revenue, men somehow dominate that. So I think that's what you've given a really great reflection. So I want for the next series of questions, we'll reverse the order. So it will be Jola first, then Tola, then Pumla. So it's 2 questions. The first, and I'll expand on them. The first is something you mentioned, Jola, which is about the good woman. I would love to hear your reflections on the good woman, especially when it comes to the African context. And Pumla, I'll steal your word. You talked about it, about gender being this prison. So I'd love to hear your reflections on the good woman, and if you see this as a sort of prison, or your thoughts on what being the good woman means. And then the second area is, and I'll give an example on the good woman. I remember our previous president, he once told Wangari Maathai, our environmentalist and Nobel Prize winner, he told her during one meeting, this was President Moi, he told her, be a good African, because she was very, she used to tie herself to trees, she used to fight for her causes. And he told her, be a good African woman, you should sit and just listen to the men. And thankfully, she was not a good African woman, so I'm very happy that she existed. So that's the good woman, reflections on that. The second is what you think of when you hear this is an African. And I'll give some examples because this can be many things. So this might be, gender fluidity is an African, homosexuality is an African, feminism is an African. I would love to hear your reflections, but especially if you have any interesting insights from history. So I can throw in some, and I'm happy we have Nigerians in the mix here. We have a South African because I know Nigeria has a culture of gender non-binary among certain communities, non-binary gender or gender fluidity. And I know also like Hausas historically have been given as an example of they have different ideas around gender and sexuality. We do have instances on the continent of women who married women. Right now, it's been rewritten to say it was about inheritance, even in Kenyan culture, but we don't know about whether there's a sexual element, but somehow all this gets revised. There's countries on the continent where gender, you're not given one of the two genders. Your gender was based on a spirit, and there's a spectrum on it was you have a female spirit, you have a male spirit, you have a spirit of both men and women. Those same-sex relations throughout the continent from Angola to Uganda. The last king before the British came to Uganda, King Kabaka Mwanga, was openly bisexual. So there's all these instances and that's mentioned also in Jennifer Makumbi's book, Kintu. So I'd love to hear your reflections on those two questions. So your reflections on a good woman and your reflections on this is an African. Jola first.
When you talk about good woman, one of the things I think about is a book by Buchi Emecheta, The Joys of Motherhood, which I don't know how to explain how I felt reading the book. And I think that's what people often mean when they talk about a good woman. Is this endless capacity for long suffering in silence? Is this sort of like deification of your capacity to, or for lack of a better phrase, to take shit and and to some extent, not just take it, but also kind of revel in your capacity to. And I think that is very often what is meant by a good woman. It's how silent you are, how long suffering you are, how much labor you can do. And I know labor is a word that's thrown around a lot, but in our context, how much can you put your dreams on hold? How much can you dream actually? How much thankless, backbreaking, long-suffering work can you do? And how much can you kind of firm that? And I think that that's what is often meant by a good woman. When when there's a kind of like a running joke on Nigerian Twitter about how once you hear, she's a good woman, just begin to feel very, very sorry for that woman, especially in the context of, she's been married for 80 years and she's just such a good woman. That's often like, it's a joke that is often used to couch a lot of, suffering socially and economically. And, now at the end of your life, the prize for all of this is being called a good woman. The prize for putting your dreams on hold, being in horrific relationships, being unable to access financing, being unable to speak your mind, being unable to be free, being unable to be who you are, being forced by society to perform certain roles that are not necessarily your first choice, be it in the workplace or in a social setting, being a certain type of wife or mother or girlfriend or single woman, or that's what a good woman is considered to be. It's just the height of being long suffering and gentle and quiet and meek and modest, regardless of what your personal temperament is what is considered a good woman, and being of high utility to a society that has no interest in being the same to you and upholding that, So that's kind of what I consider a good woman. Now, I'll be honest in saying that I haven't done quite a lot of research as in regards to your second question about when they say this is an African, but I think it depends on who is saying this is what, this is an African. I find it very tiring and kind of irritating at this point that there's a very interesting global view of this barely, very, very ethereal, almost like ethereal, but very, very I don't know how to phrase it. I'm worried that I'm not saying this correctly, but I find that when people say, this is an African, there's lots of jumping and hooting involved. There's lots of very weird wisdom that doesn't necessarily have head or tail involved. There's very extreme wealth or extreme poverty. There's very, very little understanding of complexity as people. When the world very often talking about the African, it's always like this very mystical, very interesting, in a very magical woo-woo way individual. That's quite honestly, I think you can see from my face, irritates me. I think our understanding of what it means to be an African person, an African man, woman, non-binary person is very, very it continues to unfold. And I'm anxious. I'm very, very anxious that we continue to, let me not use the phrase we, but a lot of our understanding and research into what is an African is still kind of fused through a very Western gaze. So I find that research is very often done in response to an idea, as opposed to just figuring out historical narratives about ourselves. There's a lot of it's used to push back on a Western idea or to circumvent a Western idea, as opposed to just for its sake. And I hope that makes sense to people. But that's one of the things I've been thinking about and kind of pondering about, like a lot of these ideas that we have about who we are. And our attempts to understand ourselves, I worry that a lot of that research is very often to place us in a certain context for the rest of the world to understand, as opposed to let us just find out about who we are and explain what that means to ourselves. It's almost like always like we're trying to say, oh, see, this is how we were, to explain ourselves via a very Western lens.
No worries. Thank you. Tola, next. Your reflections on the good woman, and then this is an African.
Okay. I mean, I think I align myself with much of what Jola has said in her first answer there. But I would also go further to say that I have a soft spot almost for the good woman, because I feel like, you were socialized in this particular way and you've been lucky, I use that term very ironically, you've been lucky to find a situation, one, that you expected, two, that doesn't require you to think outside the box, and three, that society praises you for, right? So I've got a soft spot for them in a sense that Nigerian women are often raised to see marriage as the end goal. Marriage and being seen as a good woman is the end goal, right? So that is how we are socialized by and large. And to get to a stage where you divorce yourself from these ideas requires a lot of work, intellectual, social, and cultural work. And it's not easy. It's not easy because it can often result in being ostracized. It can result in real loss, whether it's your family moving away from you, or your church, or your primary community just sort of rejecting you. So I do definitely have a soft spot for women who sort of get the promise of marriage, because that's ultimately the end goal of this kind of socialization, right? You will find a husband and you will be a missus and you will do all the things that good women do. So rebelling against that expectation requires a lot. And I'm often very wary of expecting women to do a lot, because to not be a good woman, to shirk being a good woman and being an irresponsible woman like myself is costly. And I don't know how many women can pay that cost. I lead the kind of life where I'm ultimately totally responsible for myself. I don't answer to anybody. I don't partake in all these community parades. I don't do it, and it's by choice, because being a woman that I am requires me to make these choices, because I don't want to embarrass my family or be around them and have to answer particular embarrassing questions. But I think if you value family, if you value culture, if you value particular things, it will be almost impossible for you to exist outside of those confines and to lead a normal, happy life, right? So the choices that I've made, I'm sort of bearing and living with and accepting the consequences of, and I'm perfectly fine, you know. So I'm an irresponsible woman. I'm an unruly woman, and I don't think it's advisable for a lot of women to sort of toe my path, because it's a costly one, you know, and it's not an easy one either. And I'm not going to pretend that it's a more noble way to exist than to be a good woman. Being a good woman is stressful, but if it allows you to exist within community, I'm not going to judge you, you know. So on sexuality, I think you asked me what is un-African. To be honest with you, I think Africans, we as Africans, we do ourselves a great disservice about what is and what isn't African, right? Because when I speak about Africa, I'm often just talking about Nigeria, because I don't have enough knowledge, enough experience of other African cultures. And to further narrow it down, I'm often speaking about southern Nigeria, right? And then narrower, my little tiny island that I come from, you know. So this idea of what is and what isn't African is a further disrespect to the Black race as being kind of simple-minded, unable to process or exist in complexities and deal with nuances. And, you know, describing us almost as a people who only sort of came into being as thinking and feeling beings when the Europeans encountered us. So Africans think like this, Africans do this, and it's annoying. There isn't such a thing as African, you know, being African. We are as different as Europeans are, as South Americans are. So the idea that something is an African never really enters my mind. You know, like we said in the first segment, there have been societies in Africa that have existed where gender was not a thing. You know, you had Yoruba warriors in Dahomey and Benin who were women who protected royalty, you know, who the French were aghast upon meeting, because to them, this isn't what a woman is supposed to do. You know, you had women leading worship for deities in my culture. You know, you have gods and goddesses whose primary communicator is a woman, etc. The roles that women weren't allowed in European societies, Yoruba women and the Dahomians were doing and taking for centuries before the European came. So I don't really know this whole non-African thing, because I don't think of myself as African. I think of myself as a Yoruba woman first and foremost. That's where I exist. That's where I'm comfortable. And even within that culture, we're super complex and super nuanced. So the idea of a primary African identifier, it doesn't mean anything to me. And I really don't really think along those lines, to be honest.
Sounds great. Kumla?
Good woman and gender prism. I agree with Tola that being a good woman is hard work. I think being a woman is hard work, but I think being a good woman is hard work. I'm often taken aback by how a good woman, of course, is certain specific things. But it seems to me that certain specific things that have already been said by Tola and Jola about, you know, being a good woman is a woman who is useful, who expresses her sexuality or doesn't in the way that is required in that society, who is in many ways kind of self-sacrificing and self-policing, and who puts the interests of others ahead of hers and doesn't rock the boat too much. I'm just kind of giving a crude version now. But it often strikes me that, in fact, everywhere I look, there are so many examples of women who don't fit the script. So it seems to me that it's much harder work to do the work of being a good woman, hard work. So I also do have empathy and some sympathy for good women, because there are rewards that are promised, and there is reprieve from constant kind of different kind of work and being policing, and you know, we like human beings. When I say we, human beings like belonging and community and some of those things. There's pleasure from those things, and so it's understandable. But I also see, of course, being a good woman as part of the prison, part of the prison that comes with patriarchal gender. So this idea. So I come from a society where also there is an enormous amount of premium placed on marriage, right? This idea not only that you be marriable, but also that you stay married, right? And so there is enormous premium on staying married regardless, right? And so on the one hand, marriage, kind of heterosexual marriage, is held up as this ultimate prize. Sylvia Damale, the Ugandan troublemaking lawyer, talks about how, you know, in many societies in East and Southern Africa, you can be a woman, you can find the cure to cancer and AIDS and split the atom if the atom hadn't already been split. But many times people will ask you, so who are you married to? You know, they'll ask you about your marital status. You'll be valued or devalued based on that. Your reproductive capacity as you know, as an obligation, not as a choice, and all of those things. And yet, everywhere I look, I see evidence of African women who seem to me quite joyful, even though there is a significant price. And then quickly, when I hear this is un-African, I'm almost always frustrated. It's very often where I sit, something that is a way to limit who we are, a way to cut us down at our knees. And it often is it needs to be said constantly as a way to bully people into being smaller. So being a feminist is un-African, we're told constantly. Being queer is un-African, we're told constantly. Being loud is un-African, we're told constantly. But almost every time this is un-African is used against us, it is a way to exile you from a community that's just like you, or many instances of people just like you that have always existed in the African universe. And so it's an attempt to correct you. And it's one that I find really difficult to take seriously, even though it often comes with such force, and sometimes violence, and sometimes threat. So, yes.
Well, as you say goodbye, I just want everyone to say one phrase which you'd want your if it's your daughter, or one phrase you'd want to leave her with, based on your life and, you know, in the gender and feminism.
I would say, there's nothing wrong with you. What you desire, what you think, what gives you joy is worth pursuing, and you deserve your own time and your own energy.
I would say stay curious, stay hungry, and stay kind. I think these are the things that have sort of guided me in the way that I've thought, and whatever kind of woman it is I am today, those three things are super important. So curiosity, kindness, and, you know, just a thirst for more. Yeah.
I would say that your life is up to you. Society will always have what it expects of you. That just be the person you are happy to be, and do the research, do the hard work. Try not to be malicious in intent or execution, but be the person that you want to be, regardless of what society or family expects of you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. That was such a wonderful discussion. I want to thank our wonderful panelists for all the amazing insights that you brought. I want to thank the festival organizers and Ake for making this possible. And I also want to thank you, the viewer, for taking the time to listen to this discussion. And I wish you all the best, and keep talking. We need to keep on having these discussions. We need to hear African women's voices, and we need to share our stories. So thank you.
That 5 minutes madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.
Let me introduce a new wave, we change the rules. A new app that you can use. Wanna change your life, then choose. Save money and invest. Pay bills when you decide. Safe and secure for you when you need a loan. Request it. One bank for you, one bank for me. So chill and enjoy the ride. Stop the call and to count on it. One bank.
One Bank by Sterling. Open a current account and start transacting.